You don't want me to turn this on until right before I start talking?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, and that's this power button, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect.
This is actually like, I know, I mean, I
Hey, how's it going? Oh my gosh, I'm a little bit frazzled right now because I just yeah, so I was just trying to figure out.
Take the kids. Oh, that's so fun.
I might have to go to the side. Well, yeah, I mean, people couldn't do that, but I like that.
I don't stand still very well, though.
Yeah, and don't worry about
I'll try.
it.
Okay.
They're going to hear you very well.
Okay, all right.
I'm glad you came up to say oh yeah, we already we already went through the handout, so this is an area where you feel that's it's great that somebody's got
Let's see.
I'm gonna go say hi to Jennifer. Yeah, I hardly make it to these things. So I know, I'm glad you're here.
I take it at a higher rate.
We're going to get started in just a second, but feel free to get up and there's plenty of food, grab some drinks, and then throughout the session.
So I keep thinking, and today, so I'm halfway here. Yeah. Well, I just halfway here. If you want to get around the car.
Go ahead and do the intro while everyone's getting snacks, just so we can keep to our time schedule. I'd like to welcome you to our first OBA-ALA joint session. I don't believe that we've ever done one of these before. I'm Michelle Praffel. I'm the president of the Nebraska chapter of the Association of Legal Administrators. I am an executive director with Fraser Stryker Law Firm. So we're happy everybody is here today. This is a great turnout, and I'm sure there'll be a few more coming in here. Before we get started, I would like to wish Dave Summers a happy birthday. I heard it was his birthday today, so let's give him a round of applause for his birthday. For those of you that don't know much about the Nebraska ALA chapter, we currently have 30 members here in primarily Omaha and Lincoln. And we get together once a month to talk through various topics. We have guest speakers. We might have roundtables where we talk about HR-related topics, IT, marketing. Sometimes it's just an open forum, a happy hour to get together and hang out with others and get to know others a little bit more. We also have business partners. We're just kicking off our new year for business partners, and I think we have a couple here. Let's see, Lexus is a business partner. Thank you. Avalon is a the business partner. We also have virtual IT, I don't think they're here, MLM, Minnesota Lawyers Mutual, and Ambius. So those are the 5 that so far have signed up. I'm guessing we'll have a few more over the next couple of weeks. At this point, I'm going to introduce Jennifer Colwell. Many of you may know her. She's kind of I would call her the brainchild behind this whole case study. She's been at it for many years, and is going to provide some insight that we can all use as we go back to our offices and deal with the mounds of records and boxes that we have. She's been in legal management for 15 plus years, has a marketing degree, and got her executive MBA a couple of years ago from UNO. So I'm going to just turn it over to her and let her run with the presentation. And there's several board members here, so if you aren't a member of ALA and you work in the legal office and would love to get you signed up. So,
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thanks again to Avalon and RIC for sponsoring this and for OBA also partnering. So this is, I said, my community service event for the year because I have done this project twice, and both times it took me 6 years from start to finish. It's a nightmare. Records management, as you all know, is kind of one of those things that nobody wants to really talk about. There's one person every month who sees a bill and signs a check. So maybe there's 2 people in the firm who see really how much you're spending on it. And when you start asking questions about it, it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg, because 90% of the problem and the mess you don't see, and it gets hairy. So today's agenda is I'm going to talk for maybe 35 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a panel, and that's Sam DelSenno with Avalon, Erin Robak with McGill, and Ian Griffith with RIC, and we'll open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to give everybody a whole pass at 4:30. If you need to go pick up kids or get out of here, whatever, feel free to leave, but we have the place until 5, and we can continue the conversation and continue networking. So they're just going to sit here and be until I'm ready, but, you know, if there's something that, you know, somebody has a question midway and you want to interrupt me, feel free. Go ahead, and they can jump in at any time, too. So our agenda for today is we're going to kind of talk about the scenario that I found myself in when I started at McGill about 7 years ago now. I was with another firm for about 8 years before that, and it was sort of the same thing. Walked into this mess and just thought, oh my gosh, I mean, this is not a legal problem. This is a problem for any company that's been in business for probably more than 20 years and struggles with what do you do with all of these old files. Talking about the budget, because that's kind of the driving factor of this. You're spending tens of thousands of dollars a year, at least we were, on offsite storage, and then you start asking that question of for what? And then you start running the numbers, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is just going to be an exorbitant amount of money to even deal with the problem, and you have to answer that question of is it worth it? And you know, there's nobody that can answer that except for you in this room after you do the analysis, and everybody's answer is going to be different. But you know, one of the vendors that I really was introduced to last year was RIC, and they're out of Arizona, and Ian can tell you a little bit more about their company, but this is one of the most unregulated industries that exists, and it's just, you just don't even know all of the details, and that's really what their company does. They're a broker to sort of help you manage this and give you those options so you don't feel like you're doing this all alone. They, for me, helped me cross the finish line for sure, and I'll talk more about that. So then we kind of have the timeline and the organization, and like I said, it's 6 years, twice. There's just no way I think that you can shorten this down, because half of the battle is the organization of it. It's not the cleaning of it. It's figuring out what you have and what you have to deal with and how you're going to deal with it. There's a whole lot of leadership buy-in required, and we know how much lawyers love their autonomy and like to follow policies without 25 exceptions. And so there's a lot of challenges that go with that. And then you have this whole off-site piece that, you know, you get through the organization of it, and then you actually have to do the dirty work, and it is dirty. I mean, the people who were working on this project for us for 13 weeks that cleaned out those 5,000 files had on full-blown surgical masks every day, and we bought a $700 air filter to maintain a working environment that was suitable enough for them to be in. These files were filthy. Boxes were just so dusty from sitting for
20, 30, 40 years. And then kind of our summary. I mean, we got through it. We are 90% of the way. We have everything off-site. We're 90% of the way finishing the project on-site. And I'm not going to say that everything's perfect. Both times that I've done this, there's been issues. And you have to make reasonable decisions. I mean, in full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer. And, you know, is every single thing that I did probably an agreement for the Council for Discipline? I don't know. I talked to them a couple of different times, and I talked to our professional liability carrier a couple of times, and Minnesota Lawyers Mutual has a great booklet. And, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, we had to make reasonable policy-level decisions. You cannot go back and start contacting clients from 40 years ago and, you know, that may not even be alive, and attorneys that are dead, and, you know, how do you go about this? And so, you know, you may or may not agree with some of the choices that we made, but the important part is you kind of have to look back at that risk factor and say, okay, at the end of the day, what are the chances of us getting sued if we accidentally destroy one file out of 5,000 we weren't supposed to? And, you know, that's kind of how we sort of attacked it, and the board, you know, was comfortable with that, but you do have to have that on board. And then we'll kind of go through that panel and questions and answers. So that's where I guess I would start with. So we were spending $30,000 a year approximately for offsite storage. It was actually probably about $7,000 or $8,000 a year higher than when I started. And we got it down because of how we stopped pulling files. So when you start looking at your invoices and you really analyze what you're paying for, over 50%, I would almost venture to guess, are administrative fees in nature. And that may or may not actually be related to even you pulling a file. But when I first looked at all of the bills, over half of the fees were related to strictly administrative expenses, had nothing to do with storage. So we should have been paying $12,000 a year to store these 5,000 boxes, but yet we're paying almost $40,000 a year. And I'm like, wow, how is this possible? Stop getting boxes back from these. You know, stop the rushes. Stop we're going to ask for files 4 times a week. We're only going to ask for files once a week. You know, we started making some changes and controlling costs that way, but it still really wasn't getting to the root of the problem. So there were 5,000 boxes total off-site. Exasperating the problem was that all of the files had been sent off-site without an assigned destruction date, number one, which meant they were all in mixed boxes. Nothing was sent by a destruction date for the box. So, yeah, that was huge. Then we had this other thing where lots of files had been sent off-site and never closed in the system. So they were sent off-site and they were still open. So then it was like, wait a second. What's the status of activity? How do we even determine when the file stopped being active? When did we stop doing work for this client? Became very complicated. Then we had the beautiful general matters. Oh my gosh, you know, a long time ago, everybody loved general matters. We'll just throw it in general, and you know, so you didn't even have matter specific, because as you'll see when we get into this a little further, every single date that I applied to destroy a file had to do with the type of law. Well, if the type of law was general, how were you supposed to figure out how long to keep it? So we'll get into that a little further. We also had the problem that we had, in 2004, McGill had moved the files from Iron Mountain to Benson, which then was acquired, which immediately resulted in 2 sets of box numbers. And then Benson was acquired by Retrievix, and then Retrievix was acquired by Access, and we hadn't re-signed a contract since 2004, when it was still Benson Records. And we were out of storage space on site. We were out of storage space, and I had already told everybody, like, stop sending files off site. Like, we're not going to do this anymore. We got to figure out how to fix this problem. So the initial analysis showed that 50%, as I mentioned, of the charges were administrative. We had been paying new rates every year because there's fine print on the bottom of your invoice that says, you know, in January, by paying this invoice, you're now agreeing to our new rate schedule that we've provided you this year. There were over 20 items on that new rate schedule that were never even listed in our contract to begin with. I would have never caught this if Ian's company hadn't really started digging into this for us. But I'm like, what? I'm like, are you kidding me? And then based on that on the 2019 rates that we supposedly had accepted because we kept paying our bills, our fees were going to be over $100,000 to permanently withdraw 5 100,000 boxes. I will tell you that the first thing that went through my head was, oh my goodness, that's a liability that's not on our balance sheet. I had no idea. And I thought, okay, that's a problem. I mean, truly, you report all of your assets and your liabilities. I mean, you know, and it doesn't even exist. There was nothing on there. And so I'm like, okay, well, just alone, that doesn't make this project even viable. And somewhere in there, you know, I got introduced through ALA to RIC. And it was sort of just, you know, happened to work at the right time. And I got the call, and I was working on this project, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll sit down and meet with you. I'll do anything to help get some help on this project that I didn't necessarily have everybody else believing in at the moment, and, you know, I feel like I'm crazy dealing with. And so I had already done 5 years worth of work at that point, but it was that additional sort of insight of, okay, this is how you're going to break this down, and we're going to get you through this. So on the records management analysis that I was kind of looking at with the cost of this is that if we didn't get rid of any of the files, we kept doing what we were doing, my budget said that we were going to spend about $192,000 over the course of the next 5 years. So it was kind of we just said we were going to still keep scanning and destroying files every year just as they come up. We were going to keep paying, and I'd gotten our fees down quite a bit, but we were still going to keep paying that 4% increase, and then we were still going to have to pay some, this was very conservative, for the few files we'd pull back, we were still going to pay conservatively $192,000 a year or total for the next 5 years. If we went with the route of saying, okay, we're going to get rid of the offsite storage, and I had already done the analysis, and we'll get into the project costs in a second, but you take those project costs out and you say, okay, really what we're down to then, and we're still going to have some, Data Shield comes to our office once a week, and we get rid of, you know, just regular routine files. We still have our scanner maintenance expenses, and then we had minimal record storage for files that had less than 5 years of life. Our cost was going to be about $29,000 total over the next 5 years. So there was a huge reason from a cost perspective to do this, but let's try and do this without having to have $100,000 in expenses. So our project budget cost ended up being roughly, let's call it somewhere between, I don't know, 50, 60, maybe up to 70. There were some hard feesing. We had our access fees is what we ended up negotiating down to $14,500. So the $100,000 got down to $14,500, and Ian can talk a little bit about how that worked. We paid a percentage of our savings to RIC. We had Data Shield destruction costs, so, and I'll talk about the logistics here in a little bit, but that was how it was destroying about 3,500 of the boxes. We paid $6,500. We had a temporary lease because in 13 weeks we had 5,000 boxes sent to us, and there was no way we had space to do that on site. And finding the space for a short-term lease like this is enough of what you need and can accommodate doors that have pallets, because you've got to have a door wide enough to get the pallets through, is not as easy as you think. And that was $7,500. And then we had some very temporary help. I did not include the staff that we have regularly in here, because we would have had them doing this anyway. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but we had an extra helper. And then short-term storage, about $15,000 for the next 5 years. We've gotten a really good deal from when I originally prepared the earlier budget, which I thought would be a little bit more, but I think it's going to be about $15,000. And then the transportation of files from Access. We used a great company called King's Moving and Storage. They're actually doing all of our storage for us too. And they were the ones who went and picked up the files every week from Access and brought them to the location, took the pallets back, and facilitated the transportation of this. By the way, I wanted to mention that if you didn't notice it, yesterday Evite should have populated and sent you a note. I created a folder on Google on the Google Drive. It's out there, and it's called For the Record, and you can just, it's a public folder, you can just access it through the Evite invitation, and all of these resources and my handouts and all of these timelines are out there on there. So the process that we went through was basically first in 2014. I started kind of working on the analysis in 2013. And then in 2014, we rearranged and we had an employee dedicated as part of her job to move into this records management role. Because if you don't have somebody that has some ownership to this, it doesn't happen. And you have to have somebody who starts getting it organized. And we really hadn't had anybody to that point. And this is not your like 20-year-old file clerk. This is somebody who can really start making some decisions and doing some analysis and helping get their arms around it. We started then assigning the type of law. So once we got that list from it wasn't even Access at the time, it would have been Retrievex. But okay, here's your list of 30,000 files. I started going through in Excel and determining with a lot of different search terms and macros and formulas how to assign that destruction date. And I searched by the matter name, by the file description, if there had been a type of law assigned, and then the date that it had been closed off site, and started literally just going through and saying, okay, this is, if it's an estate planning file, we're going to assign it a destruction date 75 years from now. And I had to end up doing this twice, and I'll go into that for a little bit, but you had to almost do it preliminarily to get your arms around it and figure out how many files you were talking about that could be potentially destroyed. Then we worked with the board, and they knew I was working on this project, but I said, I can't come to you guys every single month and ask you my 100 questions. We need to have one lawyer that's sort of designated as a champion to help with this project, and that I can have as my go-to point person, and then we'll kind of make a decision that then is a recommendation to the board. And he was a board member, and that was very helpful. We had, in the process of this, we changed accounting systems. We moved from Omega to Perfect Law, and we had all of the storage information in Omega that then had to be moved into Perfect Law and merged with this offsite database. So Perfect Law was great. I mean, we got that done, but it was another big issue. Yes, go ahead.
Was that a difficult change?
Yeah, it wasn't fun.
Okay.
It was painful, but they were great. And it was just, again, you're going from, you've got two sets of box numbers that you've already been dealing with. Now we're going to a different accounting system, and we really kind of had two sets of dates, because we had the date from the accounting system that was may or may not have been closed or closed for activity. And then we had to go into Perfect Law, and where we said everything's going to have a date. And then we had my spreadsheet that I'd gone through and said, this is what I think the date should be. So it was a lot of cleaning of data. And for those of you who know me, you know I love Excel, probably way too much. So it didn't scare me. It was all Excel, and it was just a lot of data, and you just don't think about it with 30,000 lines. You just keep taking your pieces and you get through it. We made a decision, though, in December of 2015 to stop sending files off-site. So we were not going to send anything else off-site, but then we quickly started to run out of space on-site, and so we had to start cleaning. In the process of converting to Perfect Law, we drew a line in the sand and said May 1st, well, we told everybody it was April 15th, but let's give people 2 weeks to kind of get used to this. So really kind of like May 1st of 2016, we said from this point forward, the electronic file is the master file. If you want to keep paper, go for it. It's up to you. But for a file that's opened after May of 2016, when it's time to close that file, we're going to give that file to your, we're going to tell you it's time to close it. We're going to give the file to the legal assistant. They're going to go through and pull any originals that need to go back to the client, prepare the letter for your signature that says this is how long we're going to keep it. They need to check and make sure everything is in the file that should be, and that shredding, that file is not going to records management. It is going in the shred bin. It's done. So we weren't going to rescan it. Any file that was opened before May of 2016, when it gets closed, gets scanned start to finish. So that was sort of our stop the bleeding. We identified files then on site. Yes, please, Jerry.
You have to work with different file naming conventions. So over the years, different attorneys named their files differently. And so how did you deal with that, and how did you get everything to become uniform there?
I don't know if that was as much of an issue. It was more, our problem was more general. The general files had to go away. And I don't have this on here, but it happened. We said stop. And we were horrible about regularly sending engagement letters. So we didn't have, I mean, you had a bunch of files that were sent off site that never had any disclosure to clients of what we were going to do with their files or how long we were going to keep them. And we didn't really start implementing the engagement letter policies consistently, which helped standardize the naming conventions until May of 2016. Yeah. And that's where this, like 90% of this problem does. It just grows arms, right? It's that iceberg, and it's huge. But does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, so you have a rule in place on exactly how a file is named. And
Yes.
that has a lot of information about what practice area.
Yes.
Attorney and so on and so forth.
Yes, and it's all acquired through the new matter memo.
Okay.
Yeah. And then kind of regulated by the accounting department when they open the file and make sure that it's consistent. So it's not perfect, but it's kind of good there. So we identified the files on site that needed to be destroyed, and we cleaned. We worked with RIC then to negotiate the records management contract. We started working with them in January of 2019. We executed that plan from October of 2019 to December. We were done December 23rd. And then so where we are at today is right here, where we have files with less than 5 years of life are off-site at King Storage and Moving, and it's by pallets by year. So at the end of 2020, I have 69 boxes that are all going to be destroyed on that pallet, and then 2 pallets, and then I have another 5 sets of pallets that have 2021 on it. And so those are there. They weren't worth the time and the energy and the effort of scanning. It was cheaper to save them. And they're, just off-site. And then files with more than 6 years of life are on-site right now in a small storage room that we have. There's about 375 boxes. And those are the files that are going to be scanned into the system, saved, and then the paper will be destroyed. That will take us about 4 to 6 months to get done. So if you have never really scanned a box start to finish, it's 2 hours approximately. It's an hour to prep the box and an hour to scan the box and save the box and do your quality control, depending on how many files are in there and so forth, but that's roughly the amount of time. And then we are really working this year on cleaning up our process to prevent this problem from happening. So we have a solid file opening process, but we don't have a very good file closing process at this moment yet. And so that can be topic number 2 next year. There were a lot of risks of failures with this. And this kind of comes back to Project Management 101. That's really what this is. But number 1 reason projects fail is lack of communication. So you have got to have, and you have to really identify who are your stakeholders. And if you've ever done a stakeholder analysis, it's really kind of interesting because there's 4 quadrants, and it's about power and influence and importance, and you sort of prioritizing, and nobody else ever sees this list except for you. But it's also the people who could cause a problem. So maybe they're not a partner in the firm, but they have enough influence that this could become a very big issue if they're not aware of it and don't have the buy-in. You could have a partner that has a ton of power and influence, but they're totally on board with this. So, you kind of put them into your quadrants, and your stakeholder communication comes down to who do you need the buy-in from? Who's going to cause a problem if they're not totally on board with this? The leadership support is huge. They have to understand and be able to support this. If you've got a bunch of people saying, you are not destroying a paper file, forget it. But when they realize how much money it is costing them to keep all of this paper, usually they start to listen. And again, it's not just 1 year. You're going to keep paying this for the next 50 years. You've got to deal with this, and it's not going to get cheaper. The process, that was really, you got to have a process and you got to follow it. This is not something where you can decide to make an exception for every single rule that you have. You just can't. You've got to have it at a policy level, and then you have to follow through with it. If you have to change your policy then you change your policy, but don't make exceptions. You just can't do it. It's long. Like I said, this is forever. And so all your risks are that if I would have left the firm in the process of the 6 years it took to get this done, it wouldn't have gotten done. If I would have had my key staff that were involved on this project, if I would have had both of them lost, I probably wouldn't have gotten it done. If I would have had the right people in place, and I cannot emphasize again, I actually have this down on my last point, that this often can be considered kind of a low-level position. And you think you can get away with doing this with a college intern or, a high school student or the partner's, kid who wants to come and work for the summer. No, this is not that job. This is because the first time that you have something scanned and you can't read it, because there was no quality control on it, it's a problem. These people need to be smart. They need to be independent, able to make a decision. They're going to come to you on certain things, but there's a lot of things that they're going to have to make judgment calls on when they're going through 5,000 boxes and saying, well, do we keep this or do we not? So you need to be clear on the policy and make sure you have the right people in place. Lack of risk management, I already said, you're going to take some chances on this, and it's hard to get everybody comfortable with the fact that you're destroying files. Lawyers just period don't like to get rid of files. It makes everybody nervous. And us in roles where it's going to come back to bite us when there's a file that's not there, and I'm the one who has to answer it and say, well, I told her she could destroy it. That's my job on the line. I get it. And we're all in those shoes, so that's hard. And then the ability to manage change. I've kind of just said, people are not going to be comfortable with this, so you've got to be able to be confident that you're making the right choice for the firm and sort of navigate that as you go along. I already talked about the timeline and the fact that, the key for us was dedicating one records management employee early on in this, but then she moved into a different role in the firm, and I hired another gal dedicated part-time, and then we actually ended up moving another person in. So for the last year, we had 1.5 people in our department to get this project done, and all working up towards it. Designated the board as one person that just was going to be the champion to this, and that did change halfway through. We started with one partner and ended up with another, but that was okay from a consistency standpoint. They were on the same page, but you can't have a partner in the role that doesn't support electronic files, right? You have to have them on board. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Do you suggest that the employee get part-time for this and part-time for something else, because full-time might drive them crazy?
Yeah, Dave, Dave asked if you should have, is this a part-time job, period, because of sanity reasons. And I think that like I said, it is slow, and I don't know that you can accelerate it. It takes so long to get organized that for the first 5 years, this was a part-time person. This was 20 hours a week of one person doing that job of helping me get the project organized and ready to be able to really get their, sleeves rolled up and do work. When we did make this a full-time job, moved someone internally into this role full-time, so I never hired anybody for this, really. It was just, then we had 1.5 people. I think one of the best things that they would say that I did was I made them be in the same office. So they share an office, and they could talk to each other. You do kind of go crazy. And there's enough variety of the job that, part of their day they can organize it. They can do some of it organization, they can do some of it on pulling staples, they can do some of it on scanning. But you're right, you can't have one person who stands at a machine 8 hours a day and just scans files, or they will go nuts. So I think that's a good question. And then we met weekly with the project champion to really talk about all of, as they started to really get into the files of, and this isn't the offsite stuff, we're still on-site. We're still trying to refine what our records management policy is and what is the board comfortable with adopting. We met with our partner, who I'm going to call our champion, every week and went through our list. And then we reported those minutes of that meeting to the board and said, these were the decisions that we just made, or our recommendations. Do you bless it? Do we need to talk about this at the next meeting or not? And tried to keep it short and sweet. And that really worked. So, out in the Google Drive is what our retention policy is. And that's what we developed. And there's also the MLM booklet, and Minnesota Lawyers Mutual put together a records retention booklet. They were one of the first years ago, and it was a good starting point. I think one of the hardest things about this is anybody who's looked into this, there's no black and white. There is no hard, fast rule that says this is how long we're keeping it. I think overall our firm is pretty conservative, and you might look at it and say, why are you keeping these closing books for 25 years? Well, that's what we were comfortable with. But I think it's a good starting point. And then there's also in there kind of a list of some of our notes, and it's probably not comprehensive, but where there were important things that we were had exceptions to, like all land surveys need to be scanned. Thank you very much, Avalon. That it would talk about that under the real estate section. So that's kind of helpful. But we did take a pretty conservative approach. So talking kind of that we worked from both ends, we set the electronic file date to as the May 1st of 2016. We stopped the bleeding and stopped sending files off site in 2015. We established that retention policy with the champion every week. We cleaned in-house. We said any file that hadn't had any time recorded on it for over 10 years, with exceptions, is basically going to get pulled, and we're going to deal with this. The problem that we have run into, and it is still biting us in the rear, is that we have a lot of attorneys who do a lot of work on files that never record the time, especially if it's annual minutes, DCOTs, biennials. It's just annual file maintenance. These files have been, they've been in the firm forever, but they're not getting any time recorded on them. So my new policy that I just put into place is the legal assistants are to record any activity that they do on a file in the system. We don't have to bill it. It doesn't have to show up on the bill. But if it is not recorded in the system, when I pull a report that says what was the last time that this file was worked on, it won't show up if it wasn't recorded. So if I had to do anything different from what I have done and tell you, you need to implement that policy now, because at the end of the day, you're going to start pulling from that last date of activity, and it's got to be recorded. Then we started working off-site and assigning the destruction dates, and so when I say I had to do it twice, after we really refined our retention policy, I had to go back through that list of 30,000 files and adjust it. We had said initially we were only going to keep this type of file for 10 years, and then we decided to change it to 25. So we had to make adjustments to that. And then we're working on the maintenance part right now. So off-site organization, we used the type of law as a basis. We assigned the date, as I already said, based on that activity. Nothing was ever categorized as permanent. We said everything has to have a date. So give it 100 years, give it 200 years, but please don't leave this problem for somebody else in the future. Put a date on it. And then we sorted the list with VBA codes and macros to identify of the boxes where there were mixed files that would have to be opened versus a box that every single file in there could be destroyed and you didn't need to open it. So we had about 2,500 boxes that we never opened because we knew every file in there could be destroyed based on the analysis that I had done, and so then we were only sorting what had to be done. The retrieval and destruction, we negotiated the termination of access with RIC, and again, you may do the analysis and just decide to renegotiate your rates. You may move it to a different spot. You may not take the route that we did, but we got rid of it. The logistics management was huge. The space and the equipment wasn't too bad. We did have a pallet jack that we used. I mentioned the air filter. We needed a laptop. This was the one that they used, and that was to just basically inventory the files, because we had to know that what Access told us they were giving us was actually what we got. You have to have the staff. You have to deal with them pulling the files, and they will only give you so many per week. We had to have the delivery company, we had to have the destruction company, and then we had to have the short-term storage. So in 13 weeks, about 70 hours a week was the total labor. We pulled 5,000 boxes. We destroyed 2,800. 600 were stored for the next 5 years. There were 1,800 mixed boxes that had to be sorted through, 375 boxes left to scan, and we have 220 still unaccounted for that I'm working on. So, not 100% done. Project cost will be recouped in slightly over 2 years, and it results in a $250,000 savings to the firm over the next 10 years. So that's really what kind of just all I want to talk about, and then I want to open it up to our panel and have Sam talk a little bit about your company and what you're doing for people to kind of help get this project done. Erin is our champion in the office and helped with the contract negotiation and the execution of getting these files out of access. Easier said than done. And then Ian Griffin with RIC will talk a little bit about his company and how many people they're helping with this situation. But feel free to ask any questions to any of us. Yeah, Michelle. Yeah, of course.
You just mentioned the limit per week. What limit did they give you?
Um,
Number?
It was negotiated multiple times. It started at 50. We got it up to 250. We were supposed to get it at 500. And it depended on the week. Some weeks we'd get 340, some weeks we'd get 625. It was all over the board, very inconsistent, very low.
Yeah, if you should take a look at the bottom of your scheduled charges, it's actually going to say that. And I see that they modified that throughout the years. So the normal thing used to be actually 1,000 boxes per day, probably close to 5 to 7 years ago. Then it went from 1,000 to 750 to 500 to 200 and on to 50. And people go, well, why is that? Well, if you think about it, where they make the bulk of their revenue is all based off storage on boxes. So it really doesn't help them when they say, hey, we're going to give you 500 boxes a day. When you're talking about 5,000 boxes, and they give you 500 boxes a day, you can get that stuff done in a month. Versus if you're going to give 50 boxes a day, take a look at it. But when you're taking a look at if you have 5,000 boxes, but then take a look at accounts that could have 50,000 boxes. It could take you 2 to 3 years just to remove all that stuff. This is all, again, a deterrent on top of the per removal fees and everything else that they have.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, you said now that you have your own storage space in Kingston. So what is the process to empty the box? How do you do that now?
Well, we haven't had to do it yet, so that's a great question. Hopefully we don't. But basically it's a secure facility. It's temperature controlled and it's lit. And so he has been great to work with. Jason King, who owns it, is actually best friends with one of the other partners in our office, which I did not know until after I'd already hired him, and it just ended up working out great. So I have a lot of trust in this guy. And he was, because we weren't going to do that. We were going to do like a Dino storage or put it somewhere. And he's like, I've got a huge storage facility. He's like, how about I just take these? And I'm like, how about you do that? So basically it's going to be a pain because I'm going to have to send somebody down there, and we're going to have to, we know the box, that it would be in, but we're going to have to unwrap the pallet, find that box, find the file. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but it doesn't happen enough, and for the $30,000 a year savings, we decided we could be inconvenienced a few times a year.
I don't know what your procedures were previously in terms of scanning in files, but when you're scanning in that much data, were there additional costs for long-term storage of that data? Or do you have everything in your servers?
We store, everything is on our servers, but everything's backed up. And was there an incremental cost for the remote backup piece of it being larger? Electronic storage has just gotten so darn cheap. You used to worry about it, but not enough. I don't know. Sam, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's not a huge.
Not bad. Not bad. Yes, I would love to do that. I would love to do that. Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Well, I have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you. After listening to you, I thought we had a problem.
You feel so much better. You're welcome.
No idea. Let's say you have had perfect law for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
What is your understanding of the files that are more than 6 years old? Are we required to either keep the paper file or scan it and then destroy the paper file? And if so, for how many years?
Yeah. So our general baseline for our firm decided we were keeping files for 10 years, electronically or in paper. That's our general baseline. And then everything else becomes an exception after that. So real estate was 25, estate planning was 75, conservatorships and guardianships were 75. So what is important is that your file policy is consistent from both an electronic standpoint and a paper standpoint. So we are in the process right now of destroying electronically all of those files that we destroyed the paper version of. Most of the files were so old that there's really not much in the system at all to speak of, but files that are newer in the last 10 or 15 years have a lot more information in the system. And so we had Perfect Law build a separate tab called Boxes, and that's where we assign the destruction date. And we also had Perfect Law design a specific report. It's a case list report, but we pull it by date of activity. So I can say, tell me the last time entry on every single one of the files for you that you have worked on in the last 10 years, the last date in order. And I can go to you and say, Joe, you haven't touched 700 of these files in over 2 years. Can I please assign a destruction date to them, which would be 10 years from the date the last time you touched that file?
You said that you talked to the council for discipline.
Uh-huh.
Did they give you a number, such as, say, 7?
They referred me to a number of other resources, but did not want to give me a definitive number. And that was at that time, that was probably 3 or 4 years ago was the last time we talked.
And another question I had, you said you had files, 30,000 files. Were these that were offsite?
Offsite.
Were some of those files, did I understand some of those files were still open?
Yeah, they never closed them. Most of them were.
Or were
still
they active?
No.
Oh.
No. But you didn't have a close date in the system, so then the date that we ended up using was the date that they were sent off-site, because that was really the only date we had.
Do you have did you retain any paper files that were labeled "Do Not Destroy"?
I have
You
about
haven't-
12 boxes in my office right now that I have to individually go through because they were labeled that.
Have a system where they would close some files and say "Do Not Destroy." For example, if you had settled a personal injury claim with, say, a minor, and there was a structured settlement involved.
We didn't do that type of law, so that specific question is not relevant for us, but there were definitely files that said "Do Not Destroy," and I evaluated what the contents were, and this is something that I wouldn't put. I took responsibility for all the destruction dates I applied.
And you're not a lawyer.
And I'm not a lawyer. But I did not want to put this burden on staff, because I'm the one who's going to have to answer to it, and I wanted to make sure that I was comfortable with that. So those files that said "Do Not Destroy," they got a destruction date, and it depended because it was subjective. That lawyer, maybe decided that they never wanted the file destroyed. Well, what was really in there? Is that lawyer still with us? Was this a legit reason, or was it just easier to say "Do Not Destroy"? And so I evaluated all of those, and like I said, I have 12 boxes in my office right now that I need.
And you actually looked at the documents that were there.
Yep.
And I hate to,
Okay.
but my final, I'll probably have another one. My other question is, are you saying, and did I hear you, that once a file is closed, if all the documents in there are scanned into Perfect Law, and let's say it's closed on Monday, and they're scanned into Perfect Law by Friday, you can destroy the
Yes.
paper file?
Yep, we return the originals to the clients.
That's almost heresy to me.
Okay.
But I understand,
Yeah. I mean, you close the file, you send the client a letter, you say that it will be retained electronically, it will be available for them. We keep it for about 30 days. I wouldn't do it right away,
No, I understand.
Let us know if you want to come and pick it up, but yes, and there definitely are some lawyers that are less comfortable with that than others, for sure.
I can understand that.
Yeah. We haven't really actively gone to that fight yet. Most of the stuff that we've been dealing with has been stuff that hasn't been worked on in over 10 years,
Well,
and there's been less of a battle.
In all seriousness, it makes sense.
I know.
I
It's
mean,
hard.
when you've got files that, have mice coming out of them.
And fortunately, we didn't find any mice when we opened up those boxes.
Alive or dead?
Either. My staff told me they were quitting if that happened.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wayne?
Dan, you mentioned general matters, and they have my existence as well, and you're on the land route. Do not open general matters unless you have to for some reason, but more importantly, don't open general matter, dump stuff into it. How did you deal with that? Because we have general matters, some that are voluminous, you know.
Yeah, oh yeah, we've got shelves of them, shelves of them.
For the same client, and dating back to the beginning of the firm, and, you know, but the attorney doesn't want to get rid of it. But, you know, I didn't scan, I don't know, I tried scanning and I didn't scan, but I still. But how did you deal with that?
I've picked my battles. That's all I'll say. I've picked my battles. In some of those institutional clients that take up 5 shelves of general, I haven't. I tried and I let that battle go a little early. I thought, we're not going to go there yet. So some of that. Now on the other stuff, they've stopped doing that. We're not still stuffing stuff in general, but the 40 years worth of general stuff, some of those I've just let sit because they're on site. And you know, we organized on site, we cleaned off enough on site in order to accommodate the rule that I said stop sending files off site. And I could create enough space without that fight yet. And the off-site stuff is where we spent the bulk of our time, and nobody cared.
You know, when we talk about doing general files, it's basically closing the general files so the retention clock starts, opening a brand new general file that's an electronic file. But then that way the retention clock.
It's not a bad idea.
Yeah. The other question that I hear from the attorneys, especially those who maybe do some litigation as an example, something will come up and they'll say, oh, I remember doing that for such and such a client 10 years ago. They can pull it up. Now, if you set a retention date, at some point that's gone. And so then the question is, well, how am I going to get that information that, you know, I know it's there. How am I going to get that? Do I have to deal with that as well, or have you not come up against that?
It's popped up, but I don't know.
I don't think we've dealt with that yet because we haven't started destroying our but I'm a litigator. I could see that being a concern of mine. Right, you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So I think, yeah, that's something I think that we need to figure out with our electronic files because now you can do searches in Perfect Law and find documents that are old and
Part
not have
2
to.
next year.
Right.
Right, because you could save some of those we talked before. You know, I don't remember some older, these RIC banks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Memo banks and things like that. But now you have to be so careful because yes, if somebody came in and said, okay, we need all of your information on this client,
Right.
sued you or whatever, just because you destroyed the file, over here you still have some information.
Right.
You know, so you
Right.
have to be careful about that as well. I'm just curious.
I know. I haven't.
I just have a point for that, which is that offsite storage isn't. So the firm I'm with, I used to be in our Washington DC office, and there was at Iron Mountain, the facility out in Virginia, there was a storm that ripped part of the roof off, had a cave in, and we lost files. You know, so we do the best we can with offsite storage, but even offsite storage is not, the panacea for all issues. So they're, not impenetrable. So that was a concern.
And if you look at the liability, it's nothing if that happens.
We were fortunate that it didn't end up, hasn't ended up to be anything major that was lost, but we did. We lost a lot of that, and we have to work with clients and inform them, and try to recreate what we can. So hanging on to that paper,
It's so much more of a liability than it's worth.
a liability. Even if you think it's in the most perfect, pristine condition, those are all subject to additional, natural disasters.
The professional liability carriers are extremely supportive of getting rid of your files in an electronic and paper format. Your carrier is not going to fight you on this at all. They'd rather you follow a policy, have a policy, follow a policy, and not have it if it pops up later.
Does it actually lead to a reduction in your rates because of?
I'll work on that negotiation this year. Good idea, Dave. no, no.
How about estate plans? So we have, you know, the big safe deposit boxes at the bank that are crammed with things you can get. You don't ever go check if, you know, somebody could have died, but they didn't come to get it from you, but nobody does anything with it. What are you doing, at least from like this point forward? Are you making electronic, like, or sending the original with the client and keeping the electronic copy, or how are you handling?
I've tried to win that battle and I haven't yet. Nope. We did buy additional fireproof vaults and moved everything in on site, so we don't have to go to the bank anymore to get the files out of the vaults. But no, we haven't gone through and cleaned out the half of those people, and no. It's kind of been one of those, like, is the pain worth the expense, or is it cheaper to buy another $500 filing cabinet?
Yeah, but you have them all on site.
Yeah, yeah.
I knew I'd have another one. You said that when you go through these files after they're closed, you take the originals out of the file. If there's an original anything in there, you take it out of the file.
And I want to start, we have removable stickers that all the legal assistants have, and when something comes to us from a client, it gets marked with a sticker so we know what.
Oh, when it first comes in?
Yeah.
Okay, so you take that out.
Yeah.
Do you return, excuse me, do you return the original to the client, or do you, and put a copy in perfect law, or do you have a McGill original file storage?
Nope,
No.
nope. Saved in perfect law than the original.
To the client.
Yep. The only originals that we keep are stock certificates and wills.
Well, yeah.
You know, I mean, that we have to. We have to.
With, you know, what do you do with all the wills you have? For example, I know one law firm there has a will safe. My firm.
Yeah, we have 4.
And what do you do with, I mean, you just keep, I don't know if the people are dead or not.
Well, that's what I think Michelle just asked the question too, you know, and it's just one of those, like, it would cost more money right now than it's worth to go through and figure all that out.
But you don't throw the wills away.
No, we don't.
Unless they were born in, 1840 or something.
We just haven't thrown them away. We haven't gone through it. We just bought another file cabinet and just
Put 'em
kept
in
putting it in there. I don't know if that's the right answer or not. You guys have anything to add?
Yeah, so I've been working with you guys a long time, been doing this. We scan a lot of paper, obviously. A lot of the stuff that we're scanning is typically per case. So you have a case, you need some stuff scanned, we do it. But this conversation comes up all the time. And so Jen started talking to me about this some years ago. And the biggest problem always is, where do you find the money to do this? Whether you do it in-house, whether you have us do it, somebody's got to do it, and it costs money. And so we've developed some things within Avalon, now that we're called Avalon, where we're able to kind of recoup some of that money and kind of expand those payments over time, if you will. So we may do all the work up front, but maybe we expand the payments over time. It feels more like your storage cost, and it's not going to last forever. But when it's all paid, then you have the records. You don't have that cost. And then working with Ian, he can find the money. So in the end, it's an exercise, but it's definitely doable. You don't have to do all of it like Jen's did. And she may not do it that way again if she were to do it again. But
Rip the Band-Aid off.
we actually have people that work for us that love staying at the scanner all day. So we have a couple that worked for me for 15 years. So, you can do it in-house. You can source it outside. Either way, it's going to cost you money.
Yeah.
But Ian is great at finding that money, finding the savings. And then I think the big takeaway is, what Jen did as far as putting this plan together. There's a lot of different pieces. But I think if you put a plan together, it's doable. And I'll tell you, I know about most of these problems in town, especially law firms, because they talk to me about it. Big ones, small ones, you name it. And everybody's having this problem, and I think you're the only one that I know of that's really pulled this thing off at this degree. So anyway, as you guys have questions, if this is something that you want to take on, sometimes it's easier just to have the partner write the check, but these are big checks that they're writing, as you can see. And so we're working with, right now, some corporations, their legal department, handling this stuff. And not so many law firms yet, but corporations, yes. So we're available to answer questions about it.
Can I ask you just a nuts and bolts question? When you're scanning them in, it's then in PDF form is going to be the file type?
Yeah, it depends. A lot of people want PDFs, but sometimes we're scanning into a TIFF image based on what we're doing with it. So it could be that we have some electronic discovery that we're processing, sorting, searching, so forth, and we're putting it into a review tool like a Relativity or iPro or whatever it is. In that case, a PDF's not going to fit in there. So we just put it in a format that would fit in that review tool. So it doesn't matter what format, but if you don't have a review tool, you're just going to store it, keep it. PDF is just as easy. We can OCR it and you can search it.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing, is that it's now searchable.
Yeah.
Which before you're like, I think the name started with a J, but
right.
I don't know.
And a lot of it's how you organize the case, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, how we name it, how we organize it, and then ultimately where everybody puts it in their system, to find that file easily. So, yeah.
Did you have to either buy, lease something, another machine, so that your 1.5 people could have a designated machine?
Yeah, and I did this, did this twice, so I had set up where it would always work better to have 2 computers and 2 scanners, and they're both high volume scanners. Fujitsu's my favorite brand. They run about $600, $600 to $700. They last forever. You buy a new roller kit for $50 and you put them in once every 6 months, and you're just golden. They OCR automatically. They can accommodate about 450 pages at a time of all different sizes and shapes. And then you just have to figure out what is your naming mechanism. What are you, how are you organizing this? One of the things that I didn't mention, but like on the closed file, our closed file letters are saved separately in addition to being in the file. So when you send the client the letter that says, we're going to keep this for 10 years, if you only keep that in the file and you destroy the file, now you don't have a copy of the letter that says you saved it. So they're saved like outside of that. So you just have to think through the logistics and make sure you kind of, dotted all your I's and crossed your T's. But yeah, don't give them. Don't do it off of the copy machine. And the big stuff, you're going to get into big stuff, land surveys and odd shaped stuff, and that stuff, it's either you don't have the time or the resources, you ship it off to Avalon and they'll do that big stuff for us. Yeah?
I was wondering if each of the panelists could maybe speak to the value or the way that you think it's helpful to have somebody like Jen, non-lawyer administrator, working on this type of project, or a records manager or something. There's so many law firms that don't yet have people like the ALA members that are in this audience. So, what's the value to you, and how did it help the process? I don't think Jen can speak to that on her own. She's, knows how to do it, but from your perspective, what's the value?
Well, being an attorney at McGill, I would say that, like Jen alluded to earlier, attorneys don't want to destroy anything. So it was imperative for Jen to raise this issue and bring it to the board. And, some of our board members happen to be some older attorneys who want to maintain the file. So having Jen initiate that, I think, has been huge. And, we can see the cost savings, which, I'm all for electronic files. And so getting that process going and being dedicated to it and focusing on it was huge. I mean, she could have spent her time doing something else that would have been more glamorous and more fun, but she understood the importance, so that was huge. And I would just add, and I think it's important, I think, that you all hear what Ian has to say, because, I mean, I didn't know anything about records management until Jen brought me into this, but if you are paying for offsite storage, and Ian can talk to this better than I can, but it's really important that you look at your contracts and see what you're paying and check your invoices and make sure that you're being paid what you should be paid per the contract, because we weren't, and that's where RIC helped us immensely into saving a lot of money. And I was surprised how, maybe I shouldn't have been as surprised, but I was somewhat surprised at how willing Access, once we brought this to their attention, they were willing to negotiate with us, and we were able to get our boxes out of storage, I mean, with some headache, but a lot easier than I thought we were going to. So they came to the table to negotiate right away. But I think it's important for you to hear from Ian on that.
Yeah, I would say probably the biggest thing is you're going to have to speak their language. When you're going to look at the contract, the bulk of the contracts that they put in front of people, they're not going to go through and they're not going to walk through with you.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah. What I was going to say is when Access is coming to the table, or any of these vendors, Iron Mountain, Access, you name it, they're the ones who have created the industry, and what they have capitalized on is people just directly just don't understand what a lot of things mean. When you are signing a contract with these particular vendors, I have yet to go into one organization, and we've gone through with Fortune 100 companies, all the way on to smaller law firms, you name it, throughout the country on this stuff. They really praise themselves on the fact of these people would just sign the contract without even understanding what all these fees actually mean. So my background comes from actually working for the vendors. I see firsthand, and when I originally worked for the first company that I was at, where they're trained on focus on one line item, which happens to be the storage cost. You take a look at the storage cost and you're like, you know what? You can store 5,000 boxes for X amount per month. Or you can take those same 5,000 boxes and have more risk and store them in the heart of 10 times that amount. Plus, it's not in a secure facility, blah, 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 blah. But what they don't go through is they don't go through these specific line items where it's going to directly impact you someday. When you take a look at probably the industry average, and obviously every law firm is different on this, is have 10% activity, unless you're doing exactly what Jen was doing, where you're actually pulling it up. And that's where expenses start to go through the roof when you start getting that stuff. But again, it all comes down to being able to speak their language and being able to say, you know what, yes, you think the contract reads this way, based off of this stuff, and being able to say, yeah, you're paying me the standard. You actually do behind the scenes this. When they end up taking it back, actually having that challenge. There used to people just saying, okay, my out fees are $100,000 to get that check. But the scariest thing about this, you think $100,000 is a lot? I kid you not, we have one client right now that has 450,000 boxes. 6 years ago, they could have got rid of all those documents for $1.4 million. Today, it's $19 million. Okay? You don't address that right now in that $19 million. What are they going to be at? $40 million? This is growing and growing and growing. We go, why do you think that is? Everyone in the right mind is all trying to go to a path to literal no paper. These vendors have all caught on to this. They make their money on the real estate game. When you take a look at $100,000, when you're only spending $3.5 year, let's say, investment on that, plus on how long it's going to take you to move those boxes, you're going to look at it and say, you know what, I'm just going to continue paying storage on it. But it goes, when is enough enough? They love the fact that people aren't attacking it. They love the fact that people are sending boxes out to stores that don't have descriptions on it. They prey on that. They say, you know what, they don't have descriptions on it? Well, you know you're not going to do anything with it. And by the way, now that they do want to do something with it, we're going to pull that back and we're going to charge them an arm and a leg for it, which is what Jen was talking about. You're going to see all these different fees. You'll see all these contracts like you see when you take it back from when Benson was there, and then all the new schedule of charges you go throughout these next how many years and how stuff was manipulated. You'll see specific line items moved. For instance, with Iron Mountain, they could have 3 different areas where they have pricing. They'll have standard, they'll have custom, they'll have premium. But when you go through, for instance, 4 years ago, you could have seen, for instance, a notorious fee that's called a permanent removal fee, which essentially is just a penalty for getting rid of that box. That permanent removal fee used to be underneath standard storage. What they've now done is they've actually switched that. And again, it takes a rocket scientist to fill that out, but they've actually taken that permanent removal fee and they've now listed it underneath premium. The reason why it's premium is, first of all, it's going to be at the bottom of a schedule of charges where you think you're really not going to pay for it because it's a premium charge. But in all reality, it's a contingent liability. It's an accruing contingent liability that's just progressively growing on the base, and you can have the same inventory count. It keeps getting higher and higher and higher. Yeah.
Anything else? The hall pass is passed, by the way. It's 5 minutes to go.
I have a question. Ian, I talked to you a little bit about kind of your processes, and I know one thing that I think our partners will struggle with would be the thought that we could potentially move those boxes out of access. I mean, there's very limited storage if you think of Iron Mountain or access. Is there a way to go about some of this without that being kind of the end goal? You know, utilizing you guys to help us with contract negotiations, other consulting pieces other than it's got to go through the RFP and the thought process is we have to be willing to move boxes.
No, you don't have to go through that process, but we tell people on how you get the best result is by going through that. Everything all comes down to creating leverage. First of all, Access thought they had leverage on McGill. They go, well, you want to leave us, pay $100,000. You have absolutely no leverage against them. They're like, you know what? Why would we negotiate on your rates when you just pay us $100,000 to get your stuff out? You don't like it? Pay the $100,000. So us at the table about the industry being also saying, hey, you know, thought it's $100,000, but we took a look at it. It's actually really $14,000. So now we can go back to them and say, your $100,000 really doesn't mean anything. It's like, which is only 6 months worth to spend. Plus, when you create leverage on saying, even if you guys are entertaining that, all of our clients, actually, like our figure 70-75% of the companies that engage us, they tell us we want to switch. We can absolutely fine. But why would you not want to know what other options are out there? We're not asking you to do anything. We don't have to have you switch. But if we can create leverage by the fact of saying we have vendor A over here that's going to be able to offer this, you have vendor B over here, Access knows now that they're not possibly the same player in the town, why wouldn't you want to use that and go through that stuff? And then they really see the knowledge on the background. They're going to be able to identify very quickly if you understand this industry or if you don't. So if you have an RFP, for instance, that we go through on this stuff, we have a 35-page RFP document that's strictly for this industry. That's we're talking about, for instance, one where they had the roof fall off. Because it'd be surprised to see that 15 locations throughout Omaha. When was the last time that every single one of those locations was actually looked at? So you have to take a look at, for instance, site assessments and figure out where you're actually looking at all that stuff. Make sense?
Is it time for more food and snacks? And time? Thank you, guys. Thank you.
A reminder, if you're an attorney or anybody needing CLE, the sign-in is over here. You will need to sign in to get that.